Before the episode gets underway, I'd just like to let you know that Aurora Energy Research is launching its global offshore wind multi-client study later this month. It's an opportunity for industry participants looking to expand into new markets to collaboratively develop and benefit from Aurora's power market modelling and expertise. If you're interested in participating, don't hesitate to get in touch via our website, auroraer.com. Hello and welcome to Energy Unplugged by Aurora. This podcast features various experts from Aurora having in-depth conversations with key industry leaders, policymakers and academics from all over the world. It explores the hottest topics across the energy market and gives a unique perspective on major energy issues.
Hello, Aurora listeners. Welcome to the Energy Unplugged podcast. My name is Ryan Alexander. I'm a research lead in Aurora's subscription analytics division, and I'm very happy to be joined in our podcast this week by Ben Backwell, the CEO of the Global Wind Energy Council. Welcome, Ben.
Thanks, Ryan. Hope you're doing okay.
Good, thank you. And you?
Yeah, doing really well.
Very good. Well, one question, Ben, before we jump into some of the focus of today's conversation, which is global offshore wind. I wanted to ask you, in looking at your background before you got to the Global Wind Energy Council, I saw that you were a journalist for quite some time. And after that, you moved into management consulting. So just curious, especially given your time working as a journalist, how do you think that's placed you for the role that you're in now?
Well, I think the first thing is to mention is that I worked in energy journalism for a long, long time. So looking at energy politics and policies and big picture kind of energy geopolitics. So I was mainly covering oil and gas and in particular OPEC. So I was an OPEC correspondent for quite a time. I also worked as an analyst as well, looking at global oil markets as well, and also looking at some of the big kind of global oil companies as well, both privately owned and state owned. So I think one thing I really appreciated from being in that oil and gas world is that it is quite big picture. They do look at geopolitical trends and who's doing what to whom in terms of countries and power dynamics, and quite strategic as well. And I think that's an approach I think which we can still learn from a little bit from the oil and gas world. And they had some quite good kind of publications kind of digging under the surface and trying to work out what was really going on as well, and trying to sort of verify the claims the countries were making as well. So I think I learned quite a lot of kind of investigative skills from that. And then I think the second thing to mention is I think I have an appreciation that this is really all about communications in some way. I mean, it's about technology and it's about real things, but it's also about how you lay out your narrative and how do you get people to buy into your narrative. And one thing I can see over time is the way the renewables industry and wind in particular has really kind of created this overarching narrative. It's got people to buy into it. It's become incredibly popular. All the kind of polls around the world have shown how popular wind energy is. And pretty much everybody wants to have a wind turbine in the back of their kind of advertising or their image. So I think that kind of importance of comms is something that's really underappreciated.
Yeah, very interesting. Well, let's jump into the content then. As I mentioned, the focus of our discussion today is on the offshore wind sector, and that is a sector which, by its nature, is becoming global. And as you've just mentioned, there are some commonalities there between the traditional energy sources of the past century and the emerging ones of this century, and offshore wind is going to play a big role in that. I thought it would be useful to do a bit of a tour of the globe in terms of where activity is happening, and I wanted to bring you first to the US because the Inflation Reduction Act is a hot topic of conversation at the moment. It kind of came out of nowhere last year when a deal was sealed to create a bunch of or extend and create tax subsidies or credits for renewable power producers in the US. And this is something which has really caused some ripples and caused some excitement in the industry in the US, but also caused some commotion in Europe as well. The simple question I have for you is, how big a deal is this? And how big a deal is it for the offshore wind sector in particular over there?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think it's a huge deal for international climate politics and for energy politics. It has a massive impact for onshore wind, but also for sectors related to it. So one of the interesting things about it is the credits that you can access through the Inflation Reduction Act are also good for things like green cement and green steel and electric vehicles. And there's a component in there around industrial supply chain for these things. So it's a really kind of all-embracing, kind of holistic support program, and it is a support program. It's basically about providing a huge amount of money and creating very attractive incentives for producing things in a green way. And then for offshore wind, it really, I think, enables the kind of ramp up that the US is planning, which is to get to this 30 gigawatts by 2030 from almost a sort of standing start to 30 gigawatts. So I think it underpins the growth now for kind of the next 10, 20 and 30 years. I mean, one of the things about the US system is that, as listeners probably know, that it's been based on things like the production tax credit, which gets renewed every few years. And there's always been this kind of stop-start effect in the US market, where the market will kind of get to a cliff edge to wait to see if the PTC is renewed or not. It will come to a kind of virtual stand-up, and then when it's renewed again, it will get going again for a few more years. And I think the difference this time is that this is it's a decade-long program. It provides a really high amount of high level of visibility, and so will underpin a much more kind of steady and bigger expansion in renewables.
And so, Ben, tell me then, do you believe that the worry that this is creating on this side of the Atlantic is warranted in terms of the risk that the Inflation Reduction Act poses to attracting capital towards the US and away from Europe? Is it really a zero-sum game, as some commentators make it out to be?
Well, I certainly think the US will attract capital by doing this, and it really is a bold move, and it's one that will put them really in the leadership again of climate policy and the energy transition. So it will definitely attract capital. I mean, is it a zero-sum game? No, not at all. I mean, we would expect the renewables sector and the energy transition to mobilize capital all around the world, and I think this really provides an incentive for other regions and countries to up their game and to create similar types of programs. I mean, there should be a kind of race to the top where everyone benefits by a greater flow of investment. So, yeah, I mean, I kind of understand, some people have pushed back, but I really think it would be far better to spend that energy creating something equally attractive in Europe and other regions, so that we can all carry out the transition faster.
Yeah, well, that's a good segue to the next stop on our globe trip, which is Europe. So, you just suggested that a better approach from a European perspective would be to try and, let's say, match the US in terms of the investment climate that at least federally, that they're creating for a sector like offshore wind. I mean, what does it take? What would it take to do that in Europe? I mean, it seems as though there's a few headwinds for offshore wind in Europe, and I guess, like any sector which has grown from nothing to something over the course of only a decade or two, there are some growing pains, right? I think good examples of those would be the fact that Europe has got the largest installed capacity of offshore wind by region in the world, so around 30 gigawatts. Around half of that is in Great Britain alone. Having said that, if you look at the share price of any of the OEM wind turbine manufacturers over the past few years, they've been tanking because competition for support support structures in offshore in the offshore wind sector in Europe has been so high that their margins are getting squeezed, and it leaves a picture, or it paints a picture of a sector that is not in great financial shape. So, I mean, yeah, what does it take to try and correct some of these challenges that have come up?
Yeah, it's a paradox, isn't it, Ryan? I mean, we've got these huge targets for offshore wind, and as you say, offshore wind started in Europe and reached maturity in Europe, and yet it's been pretty tough out there for some of the companies the last year or two. I mean, I do think this situation is about to change, and we're about to move into a new type of market. But let's look a little bit at some of the kind of headwinds that you mentioned. I mean, first of all, planning is really important, and even in the best cases, things take too long. I was at COP in Sharm el Sheikh. We launched this new global offshore wind alliance, and Mads Nipper, who's the CEO of Ørsted, he made the point that everywhere it takes longer to plan an offshore wind farm than to actually build it, and it's just it doesn't make sense. I mean, we need more efficiency in terms of planning, and that means that even in the best case scenarios in the countries that have done really well with offshore wind, like the UK, it takes just a really long time to get things through planning. And governments now have kind of big ambitions to obviously cut that process. The second thing to mention is, offtake agreements and market arrangements. I mean, in a way, I think we've been victims of our own success as an industry. I mean, we've driven down cost relentlessly, especially since auction type processes were introduced. But I believe in many cases, governments have tried to go too far in driving down that cost in a situation where actually the alternatives, such as fossil fuel energy, are way more expensive, and therefore in many cases we've actually restricted the amount of demand of supply coming forward. And I think that's a really important point, because what's happened is that we kind of drip feed capacity into the market. So we instead of just allowing people to come through and get a claim on the seabed and get their planning through and then construct, we kind of drip feed these things through kind of these auction processes, and then we get these kind of overheated processes where people are paying premiums to get hold of the seabed. There's a kind of race to the bottom on prices, and then that can make for a supply chain that's simply not profitable, particularly when you then get inflation and high costs for raw materials and all these kind of things that we're seeing now. So I think there's two things. First is, allow a bigger expansion. We need all this power, so why not just have a more predictable method for licensing the seabed? And the second one is to stop looking at auctions just on a price only basis and try to drive down the price to the minimum, because we need people to be able to make money to invest in supply chain. And at the moment, the supply chain is not there on the right scale for the kind of amount of capacity that we're going to need to deploy over the next 10 years. And we talked about the US and the IRA. There's also Asia growing very fast. All this is happening at the same time, and we're going to get into a situation where the supply chain is not ready for the amount of expansion that we're going to have.
Well, just to come back to your first point there, as you suggested, or you mentioned that what would be great is a more predictable process that allows for a bit more flexibility from the perspective of a developer to come in, secure an approval for a site, and go and get it built. I mean, that's one of the contrasts, isn't it, between the offshore wind sector and onshore or solar, right? Because the process you have to go through many stages of getting an approval is somewhat more centralized, whereas in the other in solar and onshore wind, there is a little bit more of an onus or let's say agency on the part of developers to be able to go and get the site they want and go and get the necessary approvals, and that does put a lot more of the ball into the court of governments in terms of driving the deployment of offshore wind, which is great if they can pull it off, right? If the planning and the parameters are there in place to attract investment. But if you land in a situation like we've seen in Europe in the past 6 or 12 months, where a couple of auctions have been notably undersubscribed. This is for onshore wind, not for offshore, but I think the principle still stands. So that recently in Spain and in Germany, that does, I guess that must inject a little bit of uncertainty, right, into the minds of investors looking at how they can where their next project is going to come from.
Yeah, I mean, I think the situation in the last few years has been there hasn't been enough seabed allocated, and that's led to this kind of slightly overheated auction market. And I think there's a kind of conceptual, kind of error here in some ways, because I think some governments are seeing things as if it's the auction that's the value. So making money out of an auction is a great thing. We've seen these kind of very overheated auctions where people are paying option prices, or they're paying huge amounts for seabed acreage. I mean, really, the value is in the energy that we're going to get and the jobs that are going to be created in the industrial supply chain, not in the auction, right? I mean, we should be auctioning, we should be releasing as much seabed as possible so people can go out and develop their projects. And I think there's ways to do that. I mean, some countries now are trying a kind of open door approach, so developers can just go forward and develop their projects. Others are, looking at just rolling auctions, so they're releasing much larger amounts of seabed. I mean, there's no reason why we should be restricting the amount of seabed. And then I think the second point is you made, Ryan, is that I think that's going to shift, and we may get into a situation where offshore auctions are undersubscribed, as we've seen already for onshore wind, because there'll be more competition for that investment. There'll be lots of markets developing simultaneously. So I think governments are going to go into a phase now where they need to look at the attractiveness of their own market to attract the investment. And somebody, I think, on a panel I spoke at recently, referred to it also as a competition between regulators. So who's got the best regulation and who's got efficient regulators that can permit things quickly so people can go and invest. That's the kind of world we're moving into, competition between regulators, competition between investment regimes to see who can get this investment, which is what will then lead to industrial investment, jobs, and skills.
Let's come back to that a bit later on, because I think that's a really key point, especially when you consider, putting into context the build out of offshore wind to date, and then adding on top of that where different markets, where different governments have set their targets for the next 10, 20, 30 years. We're talking about multiples increase in the installed capacity that governments want to see. So in Europe, that would be moving from around 30 gigawatts at the moment up to, I think, around 150 gigawatts is implied by Repower EU. So, a 5-fold increase in installed capacity over the next 7 years compared to the 30 gigawatts that we've installed over the past, 10, 15 years is quite ambitious.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be a real, it's not going to be easy to install all this power that people are thinking about in these targets. I think it's possible, but it really is going to require quite a holistic approach to looking at licensing, public acceptance, and supply chain all at once. It's quite a complex piece, and it's not going to happen on its own. And we are going to see, a really, really big ramp up. And I spend my time trying to tell people that we need to get ready for this ramp up and see how we can work together in a more seamless way if it's going to happen.
Sure. Let's then move to the next stop on this global tour and look at what's happening in Asia. I think it's interesting because my phone has got it's the algorithm has got me figured out, and every time there is a release of a new size turbine, offshore wind turbine that breaks the record of the previous one, it pops up in my news feed, which is, I don't know what it says about me, but it just says I'm a big energy nerd, I guess. But I've seen in the past maybe 2 or 3 months that there have been 2 separate Chinese wind turbine manufacturers coming out with, I think it was sort of 16 or 17 megawatt turbines, which were type tested, so certified, ready to go, and ready for commercial sale. I mean, the funny thing about all this is that, and we haven't talked about it, but China has also a similar amount of offshore wind capacity installed as compared to Europe. Now, China is not a market where it is a really viable market for inbound investment, but certainly it is one where Chinese manufacturers are seeking to increase their market share in the offshore wind segment. And look, you've talked a few times about already about this, the need to cut costs, or the fact that developers have been on a race to the bottom to cut costs, and it's been very successful. This is a good thing, right? That we have manufacturers who are coming out with more powerful and potentially cheaper turbines and driving more competition in that space. It's something that we don't really have a lot of visibility. We have a lot of visibility about here in Europe or the US until, I guess, we put tenders out and get responses from Chinese manufacturers who are ready to satisfy those orders at potentially lower prices than the established OEMs.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting situation. As you said, Ryan, I mean, there's two Chinese companies that in recent months have come out with 18 megawatt turbines.
18, was it? Yeah.
Yeah, and but we've also seen the Western manufacturers come out with these really huge, machines as well, 15 megawatt, machines as well. I mean, I think there's two issues here. I mean, first of all, China's renewables and wind sector is expanding so fast that they have invested massively in supply chain capacity. And in fact, the Bloomberg New Energy Finance report on investment that came out a few days ago shows that Chinese investment in renewables is way higher than anywhere else. I mean, the US is second, but second by a long way. So China is the biggest investor in renewables by far. And that has brought incredible strength to its supply chain because of predictable volumes. And we've seen that onshore because they pre-permit projects years ahead, and they know these projects are going to happen. And so that allows them to invest in huge scale. And we've seen China consistently be 40% of the global market and above over the last few years. So I mean, that's the first thing, and we're seeing that now in offshore as well. So they had a huge year in 2021. We'll have another big year last year, and they are now, China is by far the biggest single offshore wind producer in the world. And we're seeing provinces, for instance, now with 30 or 40 gigawatt projects planning. It's far, far bigger than even the biggest projects in the UK, like Dogger Bank. So China's supply chain is going to be really, really strong, and that will give them a price advantage. Again, we've seen that in onshore wind as well. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily that China is going to get its turbines into all the markets, right? I mean, it looks hard for China to get into European markets for a number of reasons, and the way that markets are being designed. The US has some local content incentives within the IRA. And many other countries will also want their supply chain. So, I mean, you look at somewhere like South Korea or Japan, they'll also want their own supply chain as well. So it's a kind of mixed period. It's a kind of mixed picture where everybody wants the industrial benefit that will have an impact on efficiency and on price eventually. Because it won't be just a perfect market where the cheapest turbine wins.
Which is, I guess, coming back to your earlier point about what needs to change. It sounds like this is the need for auctions that are designed in a way that really, and it's starting to happen already, right? There's a few examples of that where non-price factors are being taken into account increasingly. Such as whether it's support for local communities, use of renewable power in the manufacturing of different components. There's a laundry list of qualitative non-price factors that governments can take into account, but it's these kinds of things that are going to start to differentiate bidders in future auctions rather than on price criteria alone.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's what we're seeing, but it's also, it's things like non-price criteria around things like industrial, development and industrial investment, but it's also incentives as well. And countries, will incentivize local production in different ways. I mean, we saw onshore. There's lots of models for that. Take somewhere like Brazil, and they effectively incentivize through very, very cheap finance. So if you wanted to get a successful onshore wind project in Brazil through the tender system, the only real way to be competitive was to take the local finance, which effectively gave you zero interest rate finance. And that has resulted in them building up their own industrial system. Others have taken a more kind of restrictive approach of basically around local content. And, I think some of that, can lead to higher costs. Some of it can be unhelpful. I think we need to kind of work out a way that balances kind of international competitiveness and a cooperative approach, but which also, leads to real value creation locally as well.
Which wouldn't be, I guess the good news there is that it's not something that the offshore wind sector needs to deal with on its own, because that is an issue that kind of permeates the minds of policymakers in the US and the EU, because it's coming up in areas as diverse as chip manufacturing, raw materials like rare earths, also for use in EVs and also some parts of turbine nacelles. But it's not an issue that is an issue that's exclusive to the offshore wind sector.
And you mentioned also raw materials as well, and I think it's really important to look at everything that sits behind the supply chain. So it's not just the assembly of wind turbines, but also everything that goes into making them. And I mean, there's steel, there's copper, there's nickel, there's things like rare earth metals as well. And it looks like there's a real push by certain regions and governments to try and reduce reliance on imports for those components as well. And I think that's going to be really, really interesting because, again, it needs to be treated with some caution. I think a cooperative approach is really, really important. I think if you try and reshore everything industrial, the energy transition effectively won't happen in the time frame that we need it to happen.
Sure. Let's we talked about China a bit, just taking a view of Asia more broadly. So apart from China, there is relatively little offshore wind capacity in the rest of Asia, but there's lots of noise and lots of positive noise. Different governments have set different kinds of targets with enabling policies, and I'm talking specifically about Japan, where they've had a target of 10 gigawatts of offshore wind for a year or two now by 2030, but also South Korea, Philippines, Vietnam, India, and Taiwan is also probably no stranger to those who are familiar with the sector. What do you think is going to be different about this? I guess it's going to be a sort of gold rush or an offshore wind rush in Asia compared to what's happened in Europe over the past 10 years or what's happening in the US now. Do you have a sense from your members and your travels how the investment story might play out differently in Asia?
Well, I think the first thing to note is that Asia will try and implement offshore wind far faster than Europe did. I mean, it took us 30, 40 years, right? The first offshore wind project in Europe was installed in 1991. It's just been decommissioned. So that's 30 years. In Asia, if you look at the targets that governments are establishing, we're talking about going through that cycle far, far faster. Some countries have got significant targets for offshore wind to replace coal power, for instance. Look at places like Vietnam and the Philippines. So it's a really big ambition. I think it's possible, but government's going to need to be quite hands-on. There's going to need to be a kind of accelerated attention on permitting and market structures. Grid needs to be built out massively, and grid needs to be seen kind of proactively so it doesn't become a bottleneck. And so, the whole process is going to require very close cooperation between industry, investors, government, also actors like multilateral development banks. And there's different challenges in different places, and some of them are kind of more wealthy country challenges. Some of them are more around financing and mobilizing the investment. But it's going to be a very different challenge because of the speed that we're talking about to ramp up, and Asia will end up being kind of half the market, in my view.
Yeah, and do you have a sense of for the players who are whether they're utilities or whether they are oil and gas majors moving into this space, they're looking at all of these markets, trying to size them up and trying to look for where their next investment opportunity is. I mean, do you have a sense for them, like which of those markets starts to look more promising than others, and what is that factor, that magical factor that might tip them over the edge compared to another market?
Yeah, I think it's it's speed and predictability, and who can actually get a system working in time so that these really big investments can come in. And we've seen companies go into Taiwan, for instance. We've seen a high amount of interest in Japan. We've seen a lot of companies go into Vietnam, although at the moment there's a certain kind of delay around getting that whole market off the ground. And now we're increasingly seeing a lot of companies going into Australia and New Zealand as well. And the market signals from there and the Australian government is that they want to move very, very quickly indeed. So I think it's going to be a fair amount of competition amongst different markets to attract investment. And it will really, I think, be about having a kind of first mover advantage for a kind of large country outside of China that can really get their market going. And then, just to mention China, there is a lot of complexity within Asia about how much of this is going to come from people's local supply chain, how much, if any, is going to come from China in certain places, how much it will be the Western companies investing. And I think all of that is going to play out in the next few years.
Which makes it a pretty exciting place to be for the next few years, right? I mean, when you consider that industry is going to be built up from nothing to scale over the course of a few years is quite remarkable. I mean, notwithstanding the fact that it builds on existing supply chains and capabilities in terms of oil and gas infrastructure and vessels that are needed for wind farm installation and build out and operating and maintenance activities. But I mean, it's quite remarkable the scale that we're talking about that we're going to see in the Asian region.
Definitely, and I think there's new opportunities that we haven't really thought about or talked about. I mean, up until now, the whole market has been led by government in the sense of companies needing some kind of government framework in order to go out and build, and needing a kind of government offtake to go and build. I mean, I ask myself, is that going to change in the future, both because of the kind of very large scale nature of what we need, also because of relative prices in the energy market, and also because of the kind of actors that are going into offshore wind. I mean, as you mentioned, we've now got these very large oil and gas companies involved with huge balance sheets. I mean, at what point do people start taking a bit more risk? At what point do people take more price risk in offshore wind projects? But again, I mean, I think there's going to be really interesting kind of movements in terms of the market structure. I also think we haven't seen how green hydrogen plays into this, and having, being able to make some kind of tradable commodities also from part of the offtake from offshore wind as well. So I think the whole market structure is going to start to shift, but this is just me saying this at the moment, and let's see what happens.
Maybe that's a good segue to this discussion about how revenue models will evolve into the future. You touched on a couple of points already. So the fact that that there to date isn't really appetite for plants that are backed exclusively by merchant revenues. We've already seen a series of transactions in the past few years in Europe where offshore wind sites are backed by corporate PPAs. A recent one with BASF in Germany, for example. And so let's say it seems as though we're slowly evolving, right? But the innovations are also going to come through potentially co-location of electrolyzers with offshore wind sites, and also not just the configurations of those sites, but also other kinds of business models that maybe haven't become entirely apparent yet. There's also innovation on the regulatory side in terms of like the energy island concept that is being implemented by the Danish government in the North Sea. So do you have a sense yet, particularly on the hydrogen front, I guess, of where you think offshore wind is going to fit into that? And is there a clear front runner in terms of business model that you see emerging?
I think so we've seen, as you alluded to, we've seen in the past attempts to bring in kind of more of a merchant element into projects, whether through corporate PPAs, also through so-called merchant tail of taking some merchant risk at the end of projects, for instance, or even at the beginning of projects as well. We've seen some companies create models around that. I think one of the things we're going to see is a kind of combination between having some kind of offtake from green hydrogen, or rather green ammonia or green methanol, for instance, for part of the output, which then gives you some kind of tradable commodity. And then some merchant risk. And I'm starting to see some business propositions that are more around those kind of ideas. And some of the kind of notable kind of theorists in the industry are putting forward ideas around those kind of concepts. That to me would make a lot of sense. And I do think if we and you all know more than me about that, Ryan, but if we're looking at a long-term period of high LNG prices and high fossil fuel prices in general, that will change the dynamics, and it will, I think, entice people to take more risk and take kind of longer-term plays around price differentials between fossil fuel and renewables. So I think it's going to be really, really interesting. And then I think there's going to be technology innovation that plays into those market models as well. So floating offshore wind, and does that give you more flexibility around how you site projects? Innovation also around grid and where you can transfer power on a large scale into different markets. I mean, there's projects to sell power from Morocco into the UK. And so on and so on. And then things like energy islands, can you strategically place energy islands to be able to play a new role in the market? So I think all of this is coming now, and it's going to be really interesting to try and pick out these trends.
We've more or less hit the time we have allocated for us, and that's a shame because there's quite a lot more to discuss there. But I think it just goes to show that this sector is really taking off, and where we sit right now in 2023, I think if you fast forward 10, 20, 30 years, it's going to look like a remarkably different sector then, and it's quite exciting to be standing here at the moment, whether it's from your position as the CEO of the Global Wind Energy Council, or whether it's in my shoes sitting here at Aurora Energy Research, crunching the numbers. It's just exciting to be able to witness those changes happening and see where this industry is going to go.
No, absolutely. I mean, I do think we're in the right place, Brian, both of us, to be part of this really exciting shift over the next coming years. I mean, just maybe one thing I could just touch on as well. We set up the Global Offshore Wind Alliance and launched it at COP27. We have something between 16 and 18 countries which are now part of that alliance, which is around building ambition for offshore wind. And I think it's a real sign of the kind of momentum this sector has. And we're only going to see more of that over the next 5 or 10 years, because there aren't that many alternatives out there in terms of large scale power that's zero carbon.
Yeah. Well, Ben, that brings us to the end of the podcast. I'd like to thank you very much for making the time to join us. It's been a real pleasure having you here, and we're very keen to follow your ongoing efforts with the Global Wind Energy Council. But thanks very much for your time today.
No, thanks very much, Ryan. It was a pleasure.
That was Ryan Alexander, Research Lead at Aurora's Subscription Analytics Division, talking to Ben Backwell, CEO of the Global Wind Energy Council. Do keep an eye on our podcast feed for more in-depth conversations with senior members of the energy industry. The best way to do this is to subscribe on whatever platform you use. Thanks for listening, and goodbye.